So can you see these slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's talk about writing abstracts. It's probably the single most important thing that you're going to do, because this is kind of how you are going to be presenting your work at meetings. This is how you're going to, basically people are going to read the abstract for a paper and decide whether they want to read the paper. And your abstract is what's going to be published when you get an NIH grant. So doing a good job on making the abstract interesting and concise is really critical. So don't judge a study by its cover. I'll have Jean send you guys these slides, or there's probably, because it's already hyperlinked to the article. But the thing is, if you write a bad abstract, a lot of times it really just gives people a bad impression of your research, a bad impression of your overall, your likelihood of getting funding and likelihood of success. Conversely, if you write a good abstract, it really goes a long way towards making people feel that you are qualified. This is an interesting study. This is interesting science. So I asked my husband, who's also a scientist, what do you look for when you're reviewing abstracts for a meeting? He said, I'm looking for something that really says to me this is not interesting science. And if it doesn't come across that way, I just read the next one. So just thought I'd make sure you knew how to do it. So your abstract's supposed to be a concise summary of the entire proposal or study. You know that, at least for most of us, when we're writing abstracts for meetings, a lot of times that abstract has to go in before we've really finished and really solidified all the data. So that part's a little tricky. But in general, if we're talking about the abstract for a grant, you've got your grant written, or an abstract for a publication, you've got the paper written. So again, there's three main types: abstracts for publications. Those are different, and you'll notice the abstracts I have for publication, I kind of took a couple different kinds from different kinds of journals. So you need to make sure that you read the instructions carefully. It's very clear to me that clinical journals are going to have a different format for the way they want the abstracts put together than, say, a really basic science journal. Meeting abstracts, so this is where you're going to be presenting results from a study, but a lot of times these results are preliminary results. And sometimes you even kind of have to hedge a little in what you say, because you may, again, this may be 6 months before you're going to be at the meeting. You know you're going to have all the data by then, but how much can you say and how much should you not say? And then grant abstracts that really need to present what your hypothesis-driven research plan is. And I think grant abstracts is probably one of the hardest things, because we're basically trying to condense 5 years worth of plan into a little paragraph and get across the interesting part about your study and why your hypothesis is right and why you're the right person to do that research. So we started off with grant abstracts. That's what I sent to you guys too. Abstracts got to introduce the reader to what the big problem you're addressing, what your overall hypothesis is, and the techniques that you're going to use. You need to be able to explain, what do you want to do? Why is this an important study? And what's already been done? And I'm going to go back to, why is this important? Don't use the abstract to tell people that cancer kills people. We already know that. So you need to come up with a way to turn a phrase and make what you're saying more interesting. You know, lots of people die of cancer, but only people who eat peach pits seem to live. we want to find out why they live. You know, turn it around to make it more interesting. Make sure you explain how you're going to do the work. Now, in an abstract, you don't have the room to say 5 millimolar and 20 so-and-sos, but you definitely have room enough to give an idea of the basic techniques that you're going to use in this study. Start with a good opening line. If you start with something that is so boring, I don't even want to read the rest of the abstract. So something that kind of grabs your interest and also can't be so technical, because a grant is not a manuscript. And I think that's the biggest mistake that most people make with the abstract and with the grant writing, is they write it like they're writing a manuscript. And there's just not enough room in a grant for all of that. So here's an example of somebody from UAB, and this is their abstract. Now, I don't know how many of you know, but if you get a grant from the NIH, your abstract is on a public database. So anybody can read this grant abstract. And what we just found out recently, they can ask for a copy of your grant through the Freedom of Information Act, which I did know. And you have a time-limited amount to get back to them with a copy of your grant. So you want to be careful and hedge your bets as to what you put in this public part of your grant, this abstract that's on the database. You don't want to put too much. You know, you don't want to give away anything that maybe you haven't published yet. But you do want to make it interesting enough that people say, oh, this is a great idea, and these people have a really novel way they're going to look at this, and we should really investigate this further. You want to be careful, I think, in addition, with the title on the grant. Again, this is not a manuscript. If you make the title so long and detailed, you may limit what you can actually do in that grant. So this one I think is rank signaling and osteoclast differentiation. That's pretty generic, but it gives the grantee a lot of leeway as far as where their experiments can go. This person has had this grant for 15 years. And part of that is probably because they didn't have to change the title. If you change the title, it's a new grant. So if you don't want to have to change the title, if you don't have to.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Aren't titles limited to 57 characters, including spaces, for NIH grants?
Right. So you are limited, but people will still write really too detailed information in the. So I have to use this example. We have someone here who had a grant for 25 years. The title of the grant was Ubiquination. That's it. That's all. So he could study anything, which is what he did over the 25 years. Now, I'm not saying make your title one word, but making the title something that's a little bit generic gives you a little more leeway in renewing the grant. And I think that's important. And again, this is where we've got a difference between a grant abstract, and an abstract for a paper. So I thought this one was pretty good, especially the way they introduce it. The first sentence is really good. Gets you interested in, well, what are these, there's the diagnostic criteria is, present, blah, blah, blah. So what are these people going to do? So I want to read more of this. Here's another one, celiac and cystic kidney disease. That's pretty straightforward. It's pretty generic. And again, this person has had this grant for 12 years. And he's taken something that is okay. I don't know if I'm interested in this, and trying to make it interesting. Dysfunctional cilia, blah blah blah, and how it's involved in pathology. Here's another one. And again, you notice I tried to get mostly UAB grant abstracts that I was using as examples, which is not necessarily so in what I sent you as a handout. So let's talk, why don't we go ahead and start talking about the grant abstracts that I sent you guys. There's 3 of them. And I wanted to get some feedback from you guys about what you thought. So the first one is about cardiovascular disease. Would you fund this grant?
I think the intro grabbed my attention. However, there were so many spelling and grammatical errors. It just took away from what the author intended, I think. And it would have been helpful to have a brief explanation about the scientific or whatever clinical discovery. I'm not clinical, so it was a bit much.
Well, yeah, I think I agree. I thought that they did a good job in the first couple sentences of convincing you of the significance. What's the big problem? But they do, get down into the nuts and bolts pretty quickly. Other comment. What did you like about this abstract? Come on, somebody's got to talk or I'm going to have to call on you.
I think at the end they did a pretty good job of kind of stating the hypothesis and kind of saying how they would test it. And, for someone who might not be engrossed in this type of research, I feel like it made some sense. So.
Yeah, I think I thought that they did a really good job with their kind of opening couple sentences, and then also I thought that that last wrap-up sentence was pretty good. All right, we'll come back to this. Let's go on with the abstracts, and then because when you're looking at me, it's going to be harder for you to avoid not answering my questions. All right, so abstracts for scientific meetings, they're very short. You need to introduce very quickly in one sentence, basically, what the main problem is, what you're trying to determine, what your methods were, and what your results are. And I think abstracts for meetings are possibly the hardest ones to write. Because, again, part of it is you're writing them and you're sending them in long before you've finished everything. But also because you have to be so concise. So I think one of the things you want to make sure you do when you're sending it in is to read through some existing abstracts or published abstracts from previous meetings for that society, for that professional group. Because every group kind of has their own way of wording things and their own rules about formatting, etc. Make sure you look through the guidelines. What's the size limit? What's the format? Are there font, limits, etc. I have a lot of residents and students that I work with. And about 3 weeks ago, someone sent me a copy of a poster that was presented of a paper that had been published in a study that I had written a protocol for. And neither the author of the paper nor myself, who was the author of the protocol, was included as an author on the poster. We were not very happy. But we decided that we would use this as a learning moment for these residents and explain to them who you include and who you don't include. So make sure that you have someone read over your abstract before you submit it. Hopefully someone who's familiar with where you're sending it to and kind of what, again, you want somebody who's kind of not biased to read it and say, yeah, this comes across as something really exciting and novel and interesting. So I thought the abstract Mad Libs was really fun. Just fill in the blanks. This reminds me that we had, when I worked at the NIH, every year our institute would have a retreat, and we actually had someone submit and publish a fake abstract. Now, this was not scientific misconduct, it was a joke, but it was because so much of what we did with some of the same language over and over, the abstract was accepted and a poster was put up that had no real data. It was just a joke, and so it became an annual thing, kind of almost like a competition as to who could write the best fake abstract and get the best fake poster into the retreat. So you don't want the people reading it to not understand what the point is. So I think, again, this is the biggest challenge with abstracts, is they're so short if you're not really clear. So yesterday I was working with somebody, and she's working on it's a cardiac kidney disease, but she's sending this grant to the kidney to NIDDK. I said, you need to take out the word heart as much as you can, even though that's what you're going to look at. DDK doesn't want to read about the heart. She's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So you need to really be thinking of your audience when you're writing your abstract. Okay, so now we'll see if y'all can see me. And then we can start working on these abstracts that I sent you, some more of the homework. And y'all got coffee, didn't you?
Yes, we do.
No coffee?
Yes, we do.
Yay! Everything's possible with coffee.
There we go.
You see me? I got my
Yes, we
coffee. Okay, so we've talked about this first grant abstract. Let's talk about the second one. What do we think about the second one, the one on prostate cancer? What do you think were the strengths and what were the weaknesses?
I think they did a really good job establishing the importance of the study in the first couple of sentences.
Yeah, I did like the first couple sentences, because instead of just saying prostate cancer kills X number of men every year, blah, 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 they got straight to the point, which was they're looking at African Americans and why they have this double, twofold higher risk. So I thought they did a good job with that. What else did you like? Let's go over, we'll be like Southern. We'll talk about the nice stuff first, and then we'll talk about what we didn't like.
Hey, I just have a quick question. So I'm actually a pre-doc student and haven't written very many abstracts, but I had heard that, oh Lord, is it called acronyms? Like prostate cancer, PCA, African American AA. For me, I know it's only prostate cancer and African American, but it makes it hard to read. And I've read some abstracts that have a lot of these, are they called acronyms?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A lot of these acronyms. I was just wondering what your stance is on that. Or if you have a stance, I don't know. But I just sometimes get lost and forget. I don't know. It just makes it hard to read for me. So I don't know if you have any thought.
I totally agree. I remember I used to work at NIH. And everything at NIH is an acronym. Every institute is an acronym. Every building has an acronym. And so we called it alphabet soup. And after a while, you're reading a sentence and there's almost no words in it. It's just all acronyms. But I think in some fields, the acronyms are just inherent to the field. So what I have seen people do in grant applications is actually have a little box where they define all the acronyms at the very beginning of the grant. And then from then on, instead of keep writing the acronym and then explaining it, they just like, here's the words we're going to be using. You know, you can come back to this box. In the abstract, I think some of it is kind of, you know, like PCA and Caucasian and African American. Those seem pretty straightforward. I'm not even sure we should have to define some of it. And did you really have to make it that much? Did it make it that much shorter? I don't know. On the other hand, I think for a grant abstract, you really do have to be as concise as you can. So if you can use acronyms instead of big, long words, that's great. If you have too many acronyms, you know, that's, again, why you want somebody else to read it. What do we do with all these acronyms? Does this make sense? How do we make this readable? Because I think that's one of the things that we do as scientists and as clinicians. We're not thinking of ourselves as writers. And what we need to be doing is writing this like a writer, so that we take the reader along with us as to what this problem is, why it's important, why we're going to do it. And part of that is, you know, not having so many words that nobody can understand. And I'll tell you a funny story. So my friend, my mentor, is the head of NIH, Francis Collins. And Francis told me that he got a call from Congress about an abstract they had read of a funded research project. And they wanted to know why they were funding studies of rafts. We shouldn't be sending people rafting. Well, this was about lipid rafts as drug receptors. But they had done such a poor job writing the abstract that when the lay public got into the database, it looked like we were studying rafts. So it's another reason that you want, especially for grant abstracts, that they be very clear, because this is public. And this is where our money comes from, is the public. So I don't know if I really answered that. I think you need to be as judicious as possible with your acronym.
Thank you.
But also remember that not everybody reading these abstracts is going to be an expert in your field. So if you just throw in a bunch of acronyms, they may be lost. So what did you think about the way they presented the research idea? Yeah.
It grabbed my attention initially.
Uh-huh.
I think they kind of danced around a little bit too much. It was hard to follow the progression in which they were going to take the genetic markers that they had identified and then use them to validate and then use them to test again. I think it could have been a little bit maybe more concise and more direct in the progression, because it's definitely hard to follow in the center.
Yeah, it had it seems like there was some redundancy. And so it could have been more concise. So I concur with what she said. So.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. I thought at the end, especially to it, I think they did a good job of summarizing, but then I think they kind of went too far and more repeated themselves or said things that were pretty much obvious you could gather from the information without having to state it again.
Right. And I think one of the things I didn't include is some of these are 5-year grants. The abstracts are for 5 years worth of research, and some are for 2 years worth of research. And this particular one is only for 2 years worth of research. So if you were judging this for 2 years worth of research, do you think it's too much or not enough based on the abstract?
Maybe a little bit ambitious. Um,
Uh-huh.
they're relying on a population that is less likely to participate in research, especially John Hopkins, and they're relying on them to get the families. So it's not like they have control of the recruitment process. So it might
Right.
not be enough time.
That's a good point because, you know, they've got to recruit families, and not every, particularly African American families, are not as likely necessarily to be in clinical trials. But I'm not sure we have data yet about cancer and hereditary cancer. I picked this one because I thought it wasn't the greatest abstract, I'll be honest. And it's someone I know. So, okay. I just thought it was okay. It did get funded. The grant got funded, but that doesn't mean that the abstract was that great. Does that make sense? So, because I wanted to show some that I thought were pretty strong and some that I thought were maybe borderline. Could have been better. And I think for this one, you're right. There's some redundancy and even possibly kind of overly ambitious for the length of time that they have to study. But I do think they did it. I really like their introductory information, because too often I see people, especially with cancer, they have 4 sentences about how many people are going to die and how many people died last year and how many people are going to die next year and how many people are diagnosed. And after a while, you're like, I got it. It's cancer. People die. You know, I'm beating me over the head here. So you don't want to beat your reader over the head with the obvious thing like people die of heart attacks or hypertension is bad, but you do want to make sure that you introduce it in a way that gets right to what it is you're going to study. So let's look at abstract number 3. So it's pretty short. So what did you think about it?
I think my favorite part was how they stated the hypothesis and the way that they were going to go through their aims. So the last couple of sentences, I think were, concise and appropriate to summarize what they had talked about in the abstract.
Yeah, what I didn't like in this one is that it just finishes off, aim 3 is going to do so and so. There's no real closure. I would have liked something that kind of goes back to, you know, this study is going to help us to better understand NF-kappa B transcription, or, you know, something that kind of reminds me of what it is. Because when you get down in the weeds with the these aims, it's nice to be reminded how all of this fits together into a general project. Does that make sense? I mean, I didn't think this was weak, and it was something that got funded. And I think especially because it's something that's a little complicated, you know, I was like, well, but I thought they did a pretty good job of walking me through. I'm not an immunologist, and I could understand pretty much what it was they wanted to do. I just would have liked something a little better towards the end, and they had room. You know, it wasn't like they had exceeded the amount of space. But what else?
Excuse me. Annie Kirby said that thinks it reads more like a specific aims page versus an abstract.
But that's really true of all grant abstracts. I mean, that's what you really need to think about. Most people write the abstract the last thing, and most people are going to cut and paste some of the sentences out of the specific aims page. Because that's really the summary of your grant is the specific aims page. So I'm not going to hold that against them, but I just do think that, you know, a little more information and a little more closure, opening and closure. Think of your abstract as have a beginning and an end, but they need to relate to each other. Any other comments on this one? Some of you are very quiet. Don't make me call on you. All right, well, let's talk about these publication abstracts. So you'll see that some are very different from others in that some of them are just a paragraph, and some of them have a very distinct structure where there's a background, methods, results. What do you think about that?
So you know how earlier you were talking about, especially with publication abstracts, that you need to follow, that they have certain criteria and rules. So I don't know if one of those rules might be to bold or put first, you know, background, methods, results, whatnot. I like when abstracts do that. I think that it's very clear to me as a reader who might be, you know, pretty novice. So it helps me understand better where the researcher is going. The first one about the natural killer cells, I have no idea what that's talking about. So I got kind of confused in that one, but that's all my comments.
Okay. Well, I think the ones that are more structured with these backgrounds and objectives and things tended to come from more clinical journals. So I tried to come up with some very basic science journals and some clinical journals, and even had this case report in here. And you know, an abstract or case report is something that every resident should be able to write. You know, minimum thing, you do a study and you don't have enough participants, you can write a case report. But I think a case report abstract would be really challenging because you've only got maybe 2 patients or 3 at the most. So what are you going to say? How much can you say about that one person? And without giving away the whole paper. Other comments?
Having submitted a couple of presentation abstracts myself, I think these are very hard to write. But the thing that's important, I think, for residents and to remember is that these are often, I think a good thing to say is that it could be hypothesis generating. And so from a case report standpoint, that's something that I've used before as well. It's just to say, you know, we observed these findings in a group of patients. This could be, you know, further a good hypothesis for a further research study.
I think that's a great point. Yes, especially if you have something like a case report to say, we are going to investigate further whether other centers have seen similar cases, you know, what is a good intervention for this, or, you know, something that makes it more than just, hey, we had this one interesting person who came to the clinic. I think that's really important. And you're right, a hypothesis, if you can generate, I mean, some of them, you know, it's a case report. There's something weird we saw in a patient and it's something interesting, but it may not necessarily generate a hypothesis. Do you agree? What do y'all think? No, nobody thinks anything. All right, I'm going to ask you guys, in this room, how many of you do clinical research? Sorta. Okay. So all of you should have an opinion on a case report. Okay, if nothing else. So how would you best present a case report? How would you make that abstract interesting and novel without just being, we had this one weird case that came into the clinic? What could you do to either, is this a good case report abstract, or could you improve it? Yeah, I saw a bunch of hands. Yeah. Oh, yeah, in the back. Yay! Back.
So yeah, there you go. I think they identified something that's different, which I think is good. So they took something that usually is diagnosed at a much younger age and said, here's what we think. But I think what they're missing is kind of, it doesn't always have to be a hypothesis, but how could this be used in the future? What can we look to? And what does this interesting piece of information mean for us potentially clinically? Like you were saying, you can't take one person and determine that you're going to change treatment courses, but you can say, perhaps we can look for these findings in the futures on echo and detect things differently and see what you could use from this information.
That's an awesome point. And I think, again, it's not always hypothesis driven. Driving focuses is a case report, but you're right. What's the clinical applicability of this case report in general? Why would anyone care about this case report? Just saying that we had something interesting is just not going to cut it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my thought was just to echo the same thing. It's kind of missing the so what factor as far as where do we go from here? What is this adding to the literature?
Right. How do you use this in your clinic?
I may have missed it because I was reading it. I think the author maybe should, it seemed like it was generalizing and it can't. So I was concerned about that. And then the fact that they're looking at an 85-year-old female. I don't know about the science because of that. But I'm not clinical. I don't do case studies, but my concern would be the age. And then I think they went a little bit too far to generalize.
Okay. Well, so this one actually, I think, came out of a state. It might have been I think it was from Alabama, like State Medical Journal or something like that. Because I wanted to pick something that was something a resident or fellow easily could write and that we could look at and say, maybe it needs to be better, etc. The difference in a case report, it's not a study. That's the point. It's not a study. It's a case report. We found something weird. Yeah, we found something weird and we think everyone else should look for this. We found something weird in someone who's 85 that's normally in younger people. Maybe we could be looking in younger people, etc. What is the generalizability of this? It's not necessarily always going to generate a study. On the other hand, they could have said, we're going to use this to look for better interventions, which would be, doing some echoes on people or whatever. It just kind of wasn't too, we couldn't do, she was refused for cardiac surgery, so for what? So what happened? They don't even tell us what happened to her. If you're going to just tell us about this one person who had this weird thing, tell us how it applies to anything else. What do y'all think?
Just kind of reading it, one thing that I was looking at where they talked about they couldn't do surgery based off comorbidities and anatomy. I think, in that case, maybe if a similar situation occurs, they might kind of be able to take this information and say, what are alternatives to surgery, maybe looking at options outside of a surgical realm, which to me would, maybe be more beneficial than, this is what it is and, we could either do surgery or this. And I don't know if this is common in older people. It doesn't sound like it, but that's kind of what I thought when reading that part.
I just really wasn't satisfied with that last sentence either. It kind of doesn't wrap it up. I like something at the end that tells, kind of says, this interesting case can be applied to, others, or this interesting case suggests that we need to be more careful in screening of this. There was no wrap up. There was no generalizability. It was just, yeah, the lady said this. Period. So I didn't find this, and I don't want to say that case reports are not good abstracts or good, they're interesting. What I thought was that this is very limited in the way that it's presented. And so I wanted you guys to kind of look at it and chew on it. It's short, it's easy to look at, but it is also quite limited in the way they present it. And I think some of that comes from experience as well. So I had some students who worked with me, medical students. They looked at over 500 cases of cardiovascular disease, looked at all kinds of parameters, including ethnicity, and we were looking for health disparities. When they wrote the abstract, they just said, we looked at a whole lot of stuff, and all we found was one thing. They didn't say what they thought the thing meant or anything else, and I was like, you guys, hello. So I think part of it can be inexperience. This might have been written by a resident or a fellow. They're tired. It was an interesting case. They've got to get a case study, blah, blah, blah. But I think that, that's where having someone, a mentor who's written case studies, etc., might have helped.
Also, reading prior case studies is a huge help, like you mentioned before, just to know what they're like.
You're right. That would help. Hopefully you're reading good prior case studies, because sometimes the case study you read looked just like the one that they wrote.
Good point.
So what did y'all think of the one about the microRNAs and osteogenesis? That's number 2. I thought it was interesting, and I thought, I think it's more in a clinical journal, so I think that's why it's kind of organized this way. But I thought it was a really concise, interesting abstract. I'm not sure. It might have been Dr. Sag even who wrote that. I'm not sure. I was looking around and I thought, oh, this is interesting. Because it's something I wouldn't have put together, microRNAs and cartilage. But what did you think?
I think this is really well written. It is very concise. I mean, maybe another reader would want a little bit more detail, but I think he brought the conclusion back around to give significance to this study. Right. Saying that, manipulation of microRNA may be a novel treatment strategy, but I thought it was really good overall.
Yeah, because I think when you read through this, I wanted to read the article. Yeah. And that's the whole point of the abstract, is to summarize the article in a way that makes you want to read it, not to say, oh, ugh. So I thought this was interesting. There's some detail, but not a lot of detail, just enough to say, we knew what we were doing. What did you think about number 3?
A roadmap would have been helpful in terms of using background methods, results, and conclusions. And it was just too much for me. It was overwhelming.
Uh-huh. So what part of it was overwhelming then?
Just all the glucosyltransferase, and it was very clinical, and I'm not a clinical person, so I'm reading this. And
this is not clinical. This is very basic science.
But I don't know this science. So from a layperson perspective, it just was a lot of words. It was a lot of verbiage. And It was too much for
Well, I
me.
can tell you, this one I think was either from Science or Nature. So this is the top journal, Basic Science Abstract.
I don't
So
read that journal.
I thought the introduction sentence and the concluding sentence were good. I don't know this field, but this was like just published like last week in the top journal. And so that's why I included it, because I thought we need one, one that's like out of the top journal and some that are, clinical journals, etc. So I thought it's pretty clear. This study discloses how changes in UGCG expression impact cell signaling pathways in breast cancer. So that's pretty straightforward. Even though there's a lot of gobbledygook, you're right, in the middle, I think that, they did the best they could to kind of introduce this topic to the general science community.
So
Any other
I was going to comment. I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, I think this is interesting, and I think it's a good topic, and because it's something I work in, it made me want to read it. But I agree that it isn't the most organized for somebody who isn't familiar with all the terms in it. So for me, if you read this, I don't work in the basic science aspect, so basically what you said, I read the first and the last sentence and realize that I'm interested enough to want to read the whole thing. But I think when they have this much complexity in basic science, it is hard for somebody who doesn't work with those things to understand that middle part and what it means without reading the whole article.
I agree. And I think it's just a catch-22. If you're publishing something in Science or Nature, you can't really put it all in layman's language, although then there will be a press release from your university that'll be in layman's language. So I don't know. I didn't think it was the best, but I did, like I said, I wanted to find one that I thought was reasonable and was very recent and was in a top journal. All right, so then let's look at number 4 and we'll be done. I know you're like, whoa, yay. So what did you think of number 4?
Well, before we get into it, I had a question for you. This is the only one that actually had any data from the paper in the abstract, and I realize it's because it's more of a clinical. Do you think that's something that's more journal specific and field specific, whether to include data or not? Like most of the journals of science and nature don't include data. It's just sort of these generalizable findings. What do you think about that?
I think you're 100% right. I think it is journal specific, but I think also most basic science articles are not going to have a lot of specific data in the abstract. And again, some of that, you think about when you're writing an abstract for a meeting, if you're writing basic science, maybe you've just got some data, but you don't have this totally, bookended. So you don't want to say too much about the data. But yeah, this one, they really clearly, gave their results. Did you like it or did you not? What'd you think?
Sorry, I'm speaking so much. This looks very much like what I would expect in journals for my field, and I would say that in clinical journals that I tend to read, we always see data in the abstract, which is really helpful for me because then I don't actually have to read the whole paper unless I have time. I can determine if the hazard ratio or the odds ratio is significant or not just by reading 3 paragraphs of an abstract. So I really liked this, and I think they did a nice job kind of talking about the background succinctly and the conclusions succinctly. So I thought it was really good.
Okay. Anybody else? The only thing I thought was a little, I didn't like as much was the methods, just the way they wrote the methods part. Data from the U.S. Where from the U.S.? Where did you get this from? So I would have rather had a little more detail in that first part of the method, because it is a big study. It had a lot of samples. Where did these all come from? But that's just me. Any other comments? So I think, to wrap things together here, I think what we see is that clearly different kinds of abstracts have different formats. What you say in a grant abstract is different, probably in some ways you don't present a lot of data, etc., than what you say in a publication abstract, which is different from what you might say in an abstract for a movie presentation. On the end, the fact that it's very, I don't want to say field specific, but they are more field specific. And you guys felt comfortable with this objectives and methods and stuff in the clinical fields versus most of the basic science. Just write a paragraph, how detailed, how complicated it is, who your audience is. You've got to take all of that into consideration. The reality is, if you're planning to write an publish a paper, you need to look at abstracts in that journal and make sure that your abstract kind of looks a lot like everybody else's. Likewise, if you're writing an abstract for a grant or for a proposal, go to the NIH reporter and pull a bunch of abstracts off of the reporter. You'll see a variety of levels of good writing, bad writing, and types of, vague writing. That's one of my favorites. We did some studies and we have some results, and we need a grant for that. Hello? And then even just this case report one, I think is important for both clinical and basic science people to think about how would you use a case to either generate hypothesis-driven proposal, or what is, how you're going to generalize it so that it is more than just we had this one interesting patient or these two interesting patients. So, other questions or comments? Really? Come on, I'm drinking my coffee here. Oh. All right. Well, then I think we're going to call this a day. I hope you'll take all this into consideration when you're writing your first abstract, your next abstract. And as I said, I think you've got to remember the thing about looking at what the journal wants, looking at other examples, having other people read it so that they can tell you if there's a typo, if there's a mistake, or if it doesn't make sense, etc. Okay? Awesome. Thank you guys for getting up early. I don't know how the weather is in Birmingham. You can see behind me. We're supposed to have a shower sometime today in New Orleans. But that's okay because we're in the 70s, and I was just up at Bethesda last week and it was in the 30s. So we don't have snow and we don't have a nor'easter. And I really appreciate you guys getting up, having a little coffee, have a little breakfast, and hopefully learn a little bit about writing abstract. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
And we'll do what I do on FaceTime with my granddaughter. Bye, you guys.